Aaron, the brother of Moses, the legendary liberator, was the high priest of Israel, but in that twilight of his life, he felt more like a weary bookkeeper than a divine channel. It was the year 1446 BC, or something close to it, who could truly mark time accurately in the desert, and Israel stumbled on its pilgrimage. Aaron's life was a dense tapestry of sacrifice smoke, oiled by supplications and spiced by the constant and irritating logistics of a multitude of 600,000 people. Imagine being the pillar of faith, the only man authorized to enter the Holy of Holies, and at the same time the guy who needs to ensure there is enough linen for the garments, oil for the menorah, and most cruelly, that the water does not run out. His tent, adjacent to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the mobile heart of God's presence, smelled of incense, but also of old scrolls and accumulated sweat. He wore the richly embroidered ephod, studded with the tribal stones that glittered like small universes, but beneath the fine linen, his shoulders ached with the weight of every complaint from the camp. The stones of the breastplate, which should have been a symbol of discernment and light, seemed that day to absorb all the light around, leaving him in a cold shadow of worry. His beard, once dark and imposing, now had white streaks that looked like strands of silver sand, silent markers of that time in the desert that sucked away youth and hope. The atmosphere in the camp was denser than the smoke of the burnt offering. The sun set, dyeing the sand an aggressive rust orange, and the day's heat did not dissipate. It seeped into the tents like a bad omen. The drought tightened its grip. There were days when Aaron could hear the impatience, a collective murmur that was not made of words, but of frustration and a primal fear that God had been distracted. The high priest was hunched over a pile of inventory records, rolled scrolls marked with faded sepia ink, the endless lists of donations, spoils of war, and allocated supplies. It was not the job of a holy man, but the obligation of a crisis manager. It was there, in the calculating coldness of the numbers, that fear became an icy certainty. His eyes, accustomed to distinguishing the subtlety of colors in the sacred tapestries, fixed on a series of entries that simply did not tally. They were not scribal errors. It was an embezzlement, a considerable amount of gold, jewels, and precious stones. The war. Treasury that should have been the lifeline, the secret currency to bribe a hostile tribe or buy crucial grain at an advanced outpost, had evaporated from the allocation records. Aaron's heart did not pound harder from a mystical fear, but from the cold, earthly certainty that corruption was nested in his own home. He traced the trail of the diversion not to a Moabite enemy, but to the hands he had anointed. A small and envious group of Levites, his direct assistants, men who should have been zealous guardians of the sacred, but who succumbed to the temptation of metal that shone brighter than the law. Aaron knew them. One of them, a man named Quenau, had eyes that looked like holes burned into the soul, always assessing the price of things, never their value. He felt a pang of nausea that did not come from fatigue, but from intimate betrayal. These men, clever and sneaky, had buried the treasury, not in a distant and risky place, but under a trivial service area, in the least, a guarded part of the tabernacle courtyard, mixing it with the rubble and quicksand of daily neglect. The revelation was not thunder, but a poisonous whisper that assured him, without this gold, the next desert crossing would be a fatal logistical catastrophe. Israel's survival was now depending on his ability to act like a thief under God's nose. He let the scrolls fall onto the mat in his tent. The sound was muffled, but for Aaron, it echoed like a decree of ruin. The weight of those missing, stones and gold, was not that of wealth itself, but the weight of all the lives that would be lost without the provision it would buy. The desert does not forgive human failure, and Moses, his brother, could not be distracted from his dialogue with the Eternal, by a problem as petty and dirty as internal corruption. Aaron knew that exposing the betrayal now would cause an immediate and paralyzing schism in the camp. The people, already on the verge of hysteria from hunger and thirst, would turn against the Levites, against him, and faith itself would be shattered. He realized that the only prophecy that mattered now was not about the distant future, but about the immediate present, survival. And the only solution was silence and a night plan that felt like blasphemy. He needed to commit a profane act to ensure the sacredness of his people's lives. The sun finally vanished, taking with it the mirage of relief and leaving behind a sky of such a deep blue darkness that it seemed almost black, sprinkled with stars that in the desert seemed absurdly close, cold, and indifferent to human misery. Aaron acted with the mechanical precision that experience had taught him. Instead of a fervent prayer, he engineered a bureaucratic excuse under the guise of a ritual urgency. His voice, usually deep and resonant in moments of worship, was strangely flat as he summoned the chief of the Levite guards, a man named Uri. Broad-shouldered and with a forehead permanently furrowed by responsibility, he commanded with an authority that allowed no question that the service area at the southern end of the Tabernacle courtyard, precisely where the treasury was buried, should undergo an immediate nocturnal purification. He alleged that an unexpected and serious impurity had been detected, something that only his presence, as high priest, and the absence of all others could resolve. Uri hesitated for a millisecond, confusion clouding his eyes. "But high priest, the protocol," he began, but Aaron cut him off with a look that contained the weight of 40 years of wandering and the gravity of every divine law. "The protocol, Uri, is the salvation of Israel. Dismissed. Not a shadow must approach that area until dawn." The guard, accustomed to obeying sanctity more than logic, retreated, and Aaron felt a chilling shiver. Not from the wind, but from the moral weight of using the name of the Eternal as a disguise for his thief's mission. That command, although necessary, was the equivalent of a tactical theft under God's nose. The waiting was a torture made of silence and stars. Aaron collected the tools, and the choice of them reflected the profane nature of his plan. Not a ceremonial shovel of polished copper, but a small gardening hoe that the Levites used to clean common dirt, and worse, a piece of polished camel bone he took from the cook's utensil basket, which he intended to use to scrape the sand without making noise. The sky had reached that phase of midnight where the desert silence is so total that you can hear your own blood circulating. He moved out of his tent, his priestly vestments, the heavy ephod, the crimson mantle, and the jewel-studded breastplate that should inspire reverence, now seemed a ridiculous and heavy uniform for a stealthy assault. The tabernacle rose before him, its white curtains in the courtyard under the ghostly moonlight, looking like the walls of a forgotten fortress. The tension was not from an encounter with the divine, but from being caught by a patrolling guard. He crawled toward the south area, the smell of dry sand and old oil rising into his nostrils. With every careful and painful movement of his tired bones, he felt the weight of the irony. The high priest, the mediator between heaven and earth, was committing an act of violating the sacred ground, all to save his people. If caught, he would be stoned. But if he did not do it, Israel would starve. He had no choice. Aaron knelt down at the exact spot that the inventory record had betrayed. It was an area that smelled of compacted dust and, strangely, of old vinegar, perhaps some residue from cleaning the sacrificial utensils. He needed to be fast, but above all, silent. The floor of the Tabernacle courtyard, trodden by hundreds of Levite feet every day, was hard as dry clay, more resistant than he had anticipated. He began scraping the superficial sand with the camel bone, a harsh and continuous sound that seemed infinitely loud in the spectral silence of the night. Every scrape sent an echo of guilt through his soul. He, the man who should protect the sanctity of the place, was there, acting like a furtive gravedigger, digging in search of a buried treasure. His hands, accustomed to handling fine incense and purifying blood, were now full of coarse, dirty sand. He had to switch to the small hoe, and its first impact on the ground was a muffled clunk, which made him hold his breath, hoping that some sleepless Levite or some guard patrolling the outer wall had not heard. The fear he felt was palpable. It was the fear of being misunderstood, of having his act of desperation and pragmatism confused with the vilest greed. Aaron's forehead began to drip cold sweat, mixing with the rising dust, forming a dark mud on his face. The physical effort was overwhelming for a man his age, and his lungs burned. He remembered when he had built the golden calf. That was an era of spiritual weakness. This, however, was an era of pragmatism born of certainty. The profanation was the only prayer he could offer for the survival of his people. The top layer finally gave way, and Aaron felt the hoe sink into something softer, a layer that the clever Levites had loosened to bury their treasure more easily. The smell of moist earth rose, and with it a subtle, unmistakable metallic aroma. He discarded the hoe, and with his hands began pushing the earth away. It was then that his fingers touched something cold, smooth, and heavy. It was not a large chest, but a heavy bundle of thick linen, tied with a leather cord that time had already begun to unravel. He pulled it out of the hole with a silent groan of relief and effort. As he untied the knot with trembling hands, the contents spilled lightly onto the sand, the dull, seductive gleam of gold, small bars, bracelets, and a handful of rough gems, which looked like the eyes of nocturnal animals under the waning moonlight. The sight brought him no joy, but a deep and agonizing sadness. That treasure, which should have been the guarantee of the next harvest, the security against hunger, had been transformed into a symbol of human decay that not even the constant presence of the tabernacle could ward off. The urgency to hide it propelled him, making him forget the pain in his back. He knew he needed to restore the soil, to make the hole disappear as if it had never existed. The climax was not the discovery, but the subsequent tactical effort, hiding the truth. The act of covering the hole and compacting the sand back was almost as strenuous as digging. Aaron used his feet, shod in his leather sandals, to trample the ground, trying to imitate the natural firmness of the courtyard. He spread the dirt and the remains of vinegar, ensuring the area looked only like what it was, a forgotten, dirty corner of a vast camp. His body protested with every movement. His knees cracked and his breath came in short, painful gasps. But the fear of being discovered was a more potent stimulant than any wine. He visualized what would happen if the sun rose and one of the corrupt Levites came to inspect their hiding place and found it empty. Their fury would be silent, calculating, and above all, dangerous. Aaron knew he needed to remove the treasure from there and put it in a place where no one ever would dare to look. And what place was more inviolable than the personal sanctuary of the high priest, the guardian of the heaviest and most ornate ritual objects, those that only he had the authority to touch? He wrapped the bundle of gold and jewels in the thick fabric of his outer mantle, turning his garment of office into a getaway sack, and stood up. The momentary relief of the discovery gave way to a new wave of tension. He had to cross the courtyard, now at risk of stumbling and dropping everything. The walk back to his tent was the longest and most dangerous journey of that night. Every shadow seemed to move. Every distant murmur in the camp seemed to transform into the sound of a guard approaching. Aaron was not worried about the presence of God. He was there, in the pillar of fire and the cloud, indifferent to this human game of survival. He was worried about the envious and clever eyes of men. He crept along the side of the tabernacle, feeling the fabric of the treasure rub against his ribs, the weight of the gold, a physical anchor of the calamity he had just averted. Upon reaching the relative safety of his tent, which was surprisingly large, with internal dividers to accommodate the apparatus of his office, he went straight to the chosen location, the heavy and ornate chests of ritual items. They were boxes made of acacia wood and covered with bronze and gold, used to store the most sacred and immeasurably heavy utensils. He opened the chest containing the spare garments and the heaviest anointing vessels. With a monumental effort, he pushed the vessels to one side and carefully deposited the gold bundle at the bottom under the burial shroud and ceremonial cloths. The war treasury was now hidden in the heart of the sacred, protected by the last place where suspicion would dare to lurk. Relief flooded Aaron, a warm and comforting wave that made him stagger for a moment of pure physical and moral exhaustion. Aaron collapsed onto his mat. The urgency that propelled him was gone. Only the vacuum of exhaustion remained. He could feel the small grains of sand on his garments, in his hair and under his nails, visible marks of his profane act. He did not indulge in a cleansing bath. Water was too scarce to waste on cleaning a secret. Instead, he stayed there, breathing deeply and trying to calm the persistent pounding of his heart. The physical weight of the gold had disappeared, but the moral weight was a burden heavier than the bronze plates of the ark. He had betrayed the trust of his Levite subordinates, the ones he knew were guilty. He had lied in the name of an urgent purification, and he had profaned the sacred ground with a gardening hoe. However, he knew with a brutal and pragmatic certainty that he had done the only thing he could have done to keep Israel alive. It was not a matter of blind faith, but of pure, hard crisis management. His dignity, his image as a holy man, was dirty with sand and lies, but the caravan would move forward, and that was all that mattered. He thought of Moses, there in the tent, perhaps talking with the Eternal. He wanted his brother to know that he was taking care of the dirty side of the liberation. When the first thread of blue-gray light began to filter through the cracks of his tent, bringing with it the distant morning sound of the camp waking up, the clang of a bucket, the bleating of a goat, the dry cough of an old man, Aaron got up, staggering. The first thing he did was to vest himself, putting on the heavy and familiar high priest garments, the ephod and the breastplate, which now seemed like a disguise uniform, a mask of holiness. He touched the cold jewels of the breastplate, feeling them inert under his fingers, and thought of those treasures hidden beneath the ritual objects. The mission was successfully completed. The treasury was safe, and the supply plan could continue, but now with a secret flexibility that only he knew. Aaron emerged at dawn, with the sand still clinging to his paws and the exhaustion marked in the deep lines around his eyes, but with a silent relief that only the avoidance of an imminent catastrophe can bring. He offered the first prayers of the morning with a new and reserved dignity, the dignity of one who carries a burden greater than his faith, the knowledge that survival did not depend on a miracle, but on a profane and cunning act in the dead of night. Throughout the morning, as the camp came to life and the Levites began their routine tasks, Aaron maintained a subtle and penetrating vigilance. He was alert to the slightest sign of commotion or suspicion. His eyes, always focused on ritual, now slid across the service area, looking for any indication that the ground had been disturbed or that the corrupt Levites had noticed the absence of their treasure. The main suspect, that Quenah, the one with assessing eyes, passed near Aaron's tent carrying a basket of cold ashes. Aaron watched him closely. Quenah looked the same as always, sullen, efficient, and with an air of resentful superiority. He paused for an instant, and Aaron felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The man looked at the ground where the treasure had been, but the look was quick and distracted, just the look of someone checking where they are stepping. The relief was immediate, but subtle. The Levites had not yet realized. His strategy of using the nocturnal purification as a disguise had worked perfectly, ensuring that the hole was not immediately inspected. The high priest, under the weight of his linen mantle, had to hold back a bitter smile. He was the only one who knew how close corruption had come to destroying them all, and how ironic it was that he had to steal what was stolen to save the nation. That day was different from all the others. While administering the morning sacrifices, the sacred routine seemed empty, a theater of smoke and blood before the brutal truth he was hiding. The people's pleas rose with the smell of burnt fat, asking for provision, miracles, and the end of the drought. Aaron heard the prayer, but the only provision that mattered to him was hidden in an ornate chest in his tent. He felt like a necessary hypocrite, an actor wearing the role of faith, while inside he was a cold general, calculating the days of march and the needs for purchase. The experience of the night before had conferred on him a new and strange authority. Not the authority of the spirit, but that of pure survival. His movements were slower, his silence deeper. When he blessed the people, his outstretched hand seemed to carry the weight of the entire desert, and his fixed eyes were not looking toward the mountains of Zion, but toward the logistical future he had just saved with his own hands. He would never reveal the embezzlement, nor his nocturnal act. He would remain the high priest, but now carried the intimate and solitary burden of knowing that Israel's journey depended, in large part, on his tactical disobedience and his well-kept secret. The routine of that day unfolded under a layer of intense normality. Aaron noticed that every few hours, one of the Levites involved in the embezzlement, Quena or another, minor one, named Azel, who had a rat's face and eyes that always held a grudge, passed through the south area, but with a forced casualness. They lingered there, cleaning already clean utensils or just stopping to talk, in a disguised surveillance. Aaron realized their strategy. They couldn't dig during the day, of course, but they were there, monitoring the ground, waiting for night to fall to check if Aaron's nocturnal purification had uncovered the treasury. He felt like a chess player who had just moved a crucial piece. He had stolen the initiative from them and now controlled the game, while they were stuck on the defensive, unaware that they were being watched by the very man they had tried to betray. The physical pain of his nocturnal undertaking seemed to have turned into a mental energy, a state of hyper-focused alertness that made him process every detail, every movement, every averted gaze. That day, Aaron, the high priest, was playing a double game with his own assistants, a game of espionage and survival under the sacred mantle. He stepped away from the tent of meeting at lunchtime, seeking a moment of necessary introspection in his own tent. The air inside was cooler and charged with the potent scent of cedar and anointing oil, an aroma that usually soothed him. He approached the treasure chest, not the stolen one, but his chest, the one that guarded the secret. Aaron ran his hand over the cold gold of the box's ornamentation and felt a strange warmth in his palms. It was the warmth of unshared responsibility, the burden of knowledge. What the people saw was his serene, tired face, the man who interceded. What he saw was a logistical abyss averted by a thread. He knew that, in a few hours, when darkness fell again, those Levites would go to the location and discover the void, and their reaction would be the next and most dangerous act of this drama. They would not dare to openly accuse him. After all, he was the high priest, but the distrust would create a dangerous fissure. Aaron needed to be one step ahead. He needed not only to hide the treasure, but also to cover up the theft of the theft with unquestionable authority. The sun began to drop on the horizon, and with it, Aaron's anxiety rose. Twilight in the desert is fast, swallowing the light with a haste that always frightened him. He knew midnight was approaching, and with it, the time when the dishonest Levites would return to the service area to check for their treasure. Aaron could not be there to observe them, as that would reveal his own interest in the area. Instead, he remained in his tent, acting as if he were reviewing the Torah scrolls. But in truth, he was listening to the silence. He could imagine the scene with painful clarity. Quenah and Azel, creeping, perhaps with muffled torches, the feverish care with which they would remove the sand he had so meticulously retrodden. The discovery of the void would be a dry shock, a blow to their stomach. What would follow? Would they assume he had discovered the treasure during the purification, or that some other thief had acted? The high priest was trapped in a psychological game where the only defense was his untouchable authority. He needed to prepare for the accusing gaze, for the veiled question, for the subtle poison they would try to inject into his reputation. The night did not bring rest. It brought the invisible confrontation. When the darkness reached its peak, that time of night when the camp seemed to have died, except for the slow fire of the sacrifices, Aaron felt the change in the atmosphere. It was not a sound, but a vibration of disorder. He knew, with the keen intuition of a leader who lives under constant pressure, that the treasury had been unearthed, or rather its absence had been discovered. He waited, nerves on edge, but not a single Levite dared to approach his tent. The fear of the high priest was greater than the fury of the loss. Their silence was the proof of their guilt. If they were clean, they would have run to him, hysterical, claiming that someone had profaned the sacred area and stolen what they were guarding. But they stayed quiet, trapped in their own web of lies and the frustration of being robbed by a ghost. Aaron took a deep breath, savoring the bitter victory of his pragmatism. That silence was the confirmation that he had bought time, the most precious commodity in the desert, and that the next logistical crisis could be faced. The survival of Israel had become an intimate and unshared secret, a responsibility that isolated him from Moses and everyone else. The following day brought the inevitable exchange of glances. Aaron knew the dishonest Levites would be in a mix of fury, confusion, and fear. They had no way to report the theft without first reporting themselves. Their weapon, the secret treasure, had disappeared, and now they were the vulnerable ones. Quenah, the Levite with burned eyes, was the first to approach Aaron, feigning a consultation about the distribution of incense. His eyes, however, were empty of respect and full of a dangerous curiosity. He did not ask about the night, but about the urgency of the purification. "High priest," he said with a voice too low and velvety, "that impurity that required the purification of the service area, has it been resolved? Any sign of where it came from?" The question was bait. Aaron, the actor, responded with the serene coldness of authority. He sighed, a sound of grave weariness. "Impurity, Quenah, is a sneaky spirit. It manifests and withdraws. The area has been purified. The ground is clean. The Eternal will take care of the rest. Focus on your duties." The answer gave no information, but reaffirmed the area's status as sacred and resolved. Aaron watched the frustration flicker in Quenah's eyes before he bowed and withdrew. The high priest was teaching them a lesson without a word of accusation. Holiness has its own means of cleaning, and mystery was his new ally. That interaction created an invisible barrier of ice in the Tabernacle area. The corrupt Levites acted with a feverish efficiency, working harder than usual, perhaps to deflect suspicion, or perhaps because the loss of their stolen future had made them more cautious. Aaron, in turn, put on the mask of total disinterest. He did not approach the Yim service area, did not mention the inventory records, and focused on high-level conversations with Moses and the elders. He was forcing them to believe that the nocturnal purification had been genuine, and that the disappearance of the treasury was, in fact, an upside-down miracle where God had removed the curse and not man. The burden, however, weighed on him. During the night as he lay down, Aaron smelled the scent of gold in his tent, a subtle aroma mixed with incense, reminding him of the double life he was leading. He was the pillar of public faith and the guardian of the secretly stolen treasure of hope. The irony of the situation haunted him. He was risking his soul to save the physical lives of thousands, and the only thing keeping him standing was not faith, but his pragmatic decision. The days followed in a cautious ballet. Aaron, with his unquestionable authority, began to quietly readjust the inventory records. He could not simply reintroduce the treasury, as that would raise suspicions from elsewhere. Instead, he used the hidden reserve to cover the inevitable failures in the supply chain that arose daily. A shipment of wheat delayed because of a sandstorm. Aaron discreetly exchanged a handful of jewels for fresh supplies with foreign merchants who wandered the camp's periphery, merchants who asked no questions. In everyone's eyes, the high priest was simply being incredibly efficient in his crisis management. No one understood the source of his new flexibility and foresight. What seemed like a logistical miracle was, in fact, buried gold and renegotiated by the man with the hands dirtiest with the truth. Meanwhile, the corrupt Levites became more reserved, more silent. They communicated among themselves only with furtive glances, trapped in their own private hell. Their treasure had disappeared, and the only person who had been near it was the man they could not accuse. Aaron, from afar, watched their frustration turn into a silent fear of divine retribution. The tension between Aaron and his dishonest assistants was never resolved with words, but with the inevitability of life in the desert. The marches continued, the sun punished, and survival required everyone to do their job. Aaron felt that silence was the most potent weapon. He allowed the Levites to live in uncertainty, letting them consume themselves in doubt whether he had discovered the corruption and was simply waiting for the right moment to punish them, or if the Eternal had indeed cleaned the place in a way that defied logic. This intimate burden of being the only one to know the exact price of survival began to mold Aaron in a strange way. He became more reserved, his sermons more sober, focused not on epic miracles, but on daily perseverance. He carried with him a somber dignity, that of a man who knew that, often, faith needed to be aided by a very human and tactically impure act. The weight of the priestly vestments now was not just that of linen and precious stones. It was the weight of the hidden metal in the chest, the secret that separated him from everyone else in Israel. The tabernacle, that majestic yet mobile tent, was the center of Aaron's life. He spent most of the day between the pungent smell of sacrifice smoke and the polished shine of the golden utensils. The sanctity of that place, which once brought him a reverent ecstasy, now seemed a stark contrast to the dirty secret he carried. He entered the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place on earth, where God's presence manifested over the mercy seat, but the feeling that accompanied him was not only awe, but solitude. No one else knew that his ability to manage the people and keep them united did not come only from grace, but from the bribe money that was hidden beneath spare priestly garments. He had become the man who lied to keep a greater truth alive. The nation of Israel could not crumble. This double life required a brutal mental effort. He needed to be impeccable in his office, never letting the earthly worry that consumed his mind show through. His gestures were slower, more deliberate, each movement a shield against revelation. The difference between Aaron and Moses became even more accentuated. Moses, the prophet, spoke with the eternal face to face, bringing the law and the miracle directly from the source. Aaron, the priest, dealt with human reality, with hunger, thirst, logistics, and now with corruption swept under the rug. He saw in Moses a pure and unwavering faith that he felt he had lost a bit on the night he dug into the sacred ground. But at the same time, he felt a secret pity for his brother. Moses could afford the luxury of moral purity because Aaron was there to deal with the pragmatic dirt that faith ignored. This thought of being the impure hero was a strange comfort. He was doing the work that had to be done, the work that would ensure Moses had a people to lead. He was the silent foundation, the man who ensured the next meal and, with it, the next day of faith. The weight he carried was that of a war leader who knows that morality is often a luxury that the battlefield does not allow. Aaron was on constant alert, and his vigilance was not mystical. It was that of a manager who knows there is a thief on the team. On one particularly hot afternoon, he observed Quenin, the Levite, with empty eyes, standing for a disproportionately long time next to a pile of bronze pitchers that were being polished. Quenin was not working, but was watching Aaron's tent. His eyes lingered on the heavy, ornate chest that stored the ritual items, the same chest that now housed the war treasury. It was not a look of greed, but a look of calculating suspicion. Aaron realized the Levite was trying to track the destination of the gold. He would not dare to approach, but his curiosity was a risk. The revelation of the treasure's location would not be the end of the problem. It would be the beginning of an open schism and the loss of all his moral authority. Aaron had to act, not to punish Quenin, but to destroy his line of reasoning. He could not allow the Levite to link the nocturnal purification to his chest. Aaron waited until the end of the day. At nightfall, he summoned Quenin and Azel and two more loyal and honest Levites to his tent. Their faces were bathed in the warm light of the oil lamp, and the tension between them was as palpable as the dust in the air. Aaron did not confront them. Instead, he used his authority to create a ritual smokescreen. He claimed that due to the continuous threat of nocturnal impurity, referring to his original lie, he needed to reorganize the custody of all the most important and heavy ritual utensils. He ordered, specifically for Quenin and Azel, that they should carry the chest of ceremonial garments, which was empty, and place it in a new location in the tent of an elderly, blind priest. Then he assigned the two loyal Levites to transport and guard the bronze chest, which contained the secret. This act was a brilliant tactical move. He put the dishonest Levites to carry a false chest and, at the same time, removed their attention from the true location of the treasure. Aaron watched as Quenin and Azel, under the gaze of the loyal Levites, struggled to carry the empty chest, and saw in their eyes the confusion and apprehension. They were being led away from the trail without understanding why. The movement of the chests from one tent to another was the coup de grace in the silent investigation of the dishonest Levites. By forcing Quenin and Azel to move the wrong chest and then giving the guard of the right chest to loyal men, Aaron had cut all loose ends. He completely disoriented them. The war treasury was now under the custody of Levites who did not know they were guarding anything other than ceremonial garments and heavy utensils, and the culprits were busy, frustrated, and, most importantly, far from the truth. The frustration of Quenin, the most intelligent of the group, was almost visible. He knew he had been tactically outsmarted, but had no way to prove it. The high priest, the pillar of their faith, had become a master of sacred dissimulation, and the only thing that stopped him from questioning was the divine authority that Aaron represented. Their silence became permanent, transforming from distrust into resignation. They continued their duties, but with a new and bitter submission, knowing that the game had been lost and that Aaron's silent power had triumphed over their greed. That day was the turning point for Aaron. From that moment on, the hidden war treasury ceased to be a source of anxiety and became a source of reserved strength. The weight of the secret did not crush him, it defined him. Aaron continued to use the gold and precious stones with extreme discretion as an emergency reserve to buy crucial supplies in moments of critical scarcity. The people never knew how close famine came to decimating them and how distant the help of Moses and the Eternal was on certain occasions. Israel's survival in many of the subsequent marches depended on a profane act of management, a solitary pragmatism that Aaron guarded in his chest. Beneath the gleam of the ephod stones, he emerged from all this ordeal as the high priest, the mediator between God and the people. But he carried the intimate and perpetual burden of knowing that the great liberation had a dirty, human byproduct. The act conferred upon him a reserved dignity and a perpetual silence about how close corruption brought the people to collapse, and how he had to become a thief to save them. Aaron's secret became part of the invisible structure of the tabernacle. He no longer needed to check the chest, no longer needed to fear being discovered by the Levites. The treasure was sealed by his own act of management and by the confusion he sowed. Quenah and Azel remained at their posts, diminished and silent. The certainty of the gold's loss turning into a particular superstition that the service area was, in fact, cursed, or that Aaron's hand had a power of impurity detection greater than expected. They would never dare to dig there again, and the high priest ensured that the chest with the gold never left his custody again, moving it to a new location only under the extreme security of his own presence and the supervision of Moses, to whom he, of course, never told the actual contents of the heavy box. The solution to that entire crisis, therefore, was absolute discretion and tactical success. The gold, slowly, was drained and transformed into provisions, ensuring that the army was not unprepared and that famine was averted in the worst phases of the crossing. Aaron lived the rest of his life as the high priest of two truths, the public truth of the law and the miracle, and the private truth of necessary pragmatism. He never redeemed himself from that act of digging in the dead of night. But he also never regretted it. The reverence he inspired in the people was real, but he knew it came from a complex source, mixing divine holiness with the skill of a crisis leader who was willing to break a minor rule to save the greater rule: life. He continued to see the miracles of Moses, the manna falling from the sky, the water gushing from the rock, but he knew that manna was not enough without the wheat secretly bought with the stolen coins. The story of Israel continued, and Aaron remained the man who silenced corruption and guaranteed the future. He carried the weight of that specific day, the metaphorical sand on his garments, as a perpetual reminder that the most crucial acts in history are often the most mundane, solitary, and secret, and that heroism at times requires being a little less holy and much more human. He never had an explanation for the situation beyond the certainty that he did what was necessary, and the camp of Israel moved forward, unaware of how much its survival depended on that single dirty secret.